We want to help you win that $1 million top prize. This is episode 2 in our trilogy where we're talking about draft contests. And this episode, we're going to talk specifically about the championship format. There's a $3.5 million draft championship, and there's a mini version and a mega version as well. We're going to talk about all of that and how to get you all the way to the end of the finals in these tournaments. So I'm Austin Lee. I'm joined by David Dodds, James Brimacombe, Dan Hindrey. We're going to talk about bestballdraft.com. Let's do this. If you missed episode 1, be sure to go check that out. So I'm going to pitch it to Dan first on this one. Dan, I think you made it to the finals in the Mega Championship last year, so I want to hear a little bit about that experience, and I want to hear you tell us how this is different than sort of a standard draft contest.
Yeah, okay. So I'll start off with kind of how it's different and then go through sort of how it was. So you play for 12 weeks, and whoever wins their league moves on to the playoffs. And there's hyper elimination in the playoffs. So this year it's the top 3 out of 24 teams in each matchup move on. So only 12.5% are moving on. 1 out of 8 teams move on each week in the playoffs. So it's really like a gauntlet you have to run through, and there's just a ton of luck involved. We're going to talk about some strategies that kind of help you like put the luck in your favor, but there's still a lot of luck involved. You have to have good players, and you need them to have big weeks at the right time, which is kind of my experience last year. I think there were a couple that I'll always remember. One week I felt like I was dead in the water, and Amari Cooper was playing late afternoon, and he scored about 35 points in the fourth quarter in overtime. And it was just like, I was like, I'm done. And then I was like, oh, he scored. And I'm like, oh, it's going to overtime. That's cool. And like, he scored again. And just, he kind of carried me through one week. And then the week before Christmas, I was visiting with my in-laws, and we were watching the Saturday game was the Texans game, and DeAndre Hopkins went off for like 45 points. And it's just like, that's all I need. And kind of these weeks, you hope you have some of these really high upside guys, and you hope they hit at the right time. And so it ends up being a lot of fun.
Yeah, and so it's different, right? I mean, like in the standard contests, you're sort of playing for, each week has a little bit of a similar weight to it, right? And you're doing 16 weeks. With this, it's kind of the first 12 weeks is kind of like that. But, man, that gauntlet 13, 15, 14, 15, 16 is way different. So the big best ball championship is a $25 entry, and the top prize is $1 million. But if that's too rich for your blood, then there's a $5 entry mini that has a similar format. And then if you want something that's a little higher stakes, they have the mega champion, which is a $125 entry. James, tell me a little bit about how your approach is different for these championships than it is for a standard draft league.
Okay. Yeah, the standard draft leagues, I'm treating those more like a kind of the old school DFS, the daily fantasy, just cash games. So that's what I'm looking at on just the regular side of the best ball. So I play it a lot safer. I prefer to take 3 quarterbacks in that format. But yeah, in this championship format, you don't want to take 3 quarterbacks. You want to you want to take your shots. The same with tight end. I feel like you just want 2. You want 2 quarterbacks, 2 tight ends, and you just want those guys to hit. You want to look at different strategies, like kind of who you pair them with, and then you just want to take some of those late, the last few rounds. I prefer to take instead of just getting depth guys or guys I think might score 8 points this week. I want to try to get those big running back handcuffs that might just hit a home run at the end of the year. So it's kind of you're kind of looking more just to all or nothing.
Yeah, I like the DFS analogy where it's like the standard contest on draft is sort of like a cash game, and this is like the GPP of draft, where you got to take some risks, take some shots, and go big or go home. David, talk to me a little bit about how you approach these differently.
Yeah, it's about youth. It's about stacks. It's about guys with just ridiculous upside. So guys that are potentially flying way below the radar, but we just don't know enough of their game, whether they're a rookie, maybe they're a second-year player that got hurt their first year. You're taking a lot more shots on those guys. You don't want the third down running back that's only going to play that role, even if the guy gets hurt in front of him. So you want to take shots of guys. And so I say the same thing of what both James and Dan were saying is in this format, I'm almost always going to go 2 quarterbacks and 2 tight ends. If my quarterback gets hurt, I wasn't going to win anyway. So you're counting on them to win. And then you also just want to make sure you have pairs with those guys. Not only are you expecting them to play well, you're expecting to have a lot of that action when they do play well, hopefully in the closing weeks.
Yeah. I heard you mention stacks there. I want to pitch it over to Dan and to get his take on stacking. And do you do it more often in this format, and how important is it to this format?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely. You're trying to increase your variance. You want to finish first or last is kind of how you want to approach these, because there's nothing for second, nothing for third if you don't get out of your 12-man.
Shake and bake.
Yeah, you gotta swing for the fences. So part of that is like full season long. There's going to be just correlations if one offense. The example last year is like Mahomes and Kelsey was like the home run, where those guys just both crushed where they were. What you would expect from guys drafted in the 3rd, and Mahomes like the 9th round, where you want to pair those guys up. Where if you had taken say Rob Gronkowski early and then got Mahomes later, Mahomes, he helped you, but then you don't have that big upside. Where you want the 2 to be combined, so you either if you have Brady and Gronk and you go down in flames, it doesn't matter if you finish 12th or 8th or 4th. You want to have those real upside just to get you in first place in your 12 team. And then there's also a positive impact once you get to the playoffs, because you're trying to beat some other really good teams. So once you get to those playoffs, you're playing other teams that won their league also. So there's some really good rosters, and you're going to probably need a high score to move on. So you want to have, if your quarterback has a big 35-point game, there's a good chance his wide receiver or tight end or somebody did also. So if you have those, it increases your odds of moving on in the playoffs. And if you're lucky enough to get to the final, maybe your stack hits and you actually do get that $1 million.
Yeah, because if you ain't first, you're last. David, tell me about youth. You mentioned youth a little bit a second ago. What are you looking for there?
Yeah, just guys that are way below the radar that are young. J.J. Arcega-Whiteside is a perfect example of a guy that in a lot of normal 12-man, he doesn't even get drafted. He's like right at the fringe of maybe drafting, but that's a guy that if you can get in the 18th round, he might be Philadelphia's number 1 receiver by the end of the year. So again, you're just looking, Dan talked a little about, the top spots at receiver stay kind of locked, but if you could just fly and sometimes get a running back that maybe was a second stringer, a tight end, the second stringer, youth movement on something that happens. I mean, we all remember last year, Alex Collins was a sure thing in Baltimore. And then who was really running the rock at the end of the year was Gus Edwards. And if you had Gus Edwards at the end of this thing and you got him in the 18th round, you're the kind of team that could separate from all of these other dream teams that made it in the final. So you have to have enough of those darts. You do that by not spending on quarterback and tight end, and you got to throw a lot of darts. You also got to look hard at strength of schedule. Hopefully we'll talk about that a little bit as well.
Sure. James, I'm wondering if people are kind of taking more risks and maybe throwing a little bit more darts, does that shift the ADP in any kind of weird ways in this style of draft more so than maybe the more conservative sort of contests?
I would assume, yeah. There's not a championship ADP. It's all grouped together. So all the numbers we're looking at are all any 12-man that day on draft. We're going to get to the ADP.
Yeah.
So it's a mix of the regular and the championship. But yeah, I imagine like round 14 through the end of the draft, it's just all over the place. I mean, people are just taking shots everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of in the tournaments, it does push up some of those like Damian Harris or some of those running backs where you might need an injury, but if that injury hits, you're really sitting well. I think in these championship drafts, it pushes some of those guys up. It pushes your Kyler Murrays up, kind of like the hot young players who you can at least kind of dream on. Those are the guys who get pushed up, but they should be pushed up, in my opinion. I think they should be pushed up. When I was looking last year, I kind of compared how much value guys returned versus their ADP, and the top 6 guys were an average age of 23. Ebron was the oldest of the group at 25. So, once you get these older players, we mostly know what we're going to get. We have a large sample size where we just have no idea with these young guys. So you really want to target these young running backs. Like last year was Chubb. Nick Chubb was a big hit. James Conner, who was 23, just hit like crazy in the last round. So this year you're looking at guys like maybe Miles Sanders, Christian Kirk, some of these first, second-year players who we don't really know. Like they could be bad, they could be good. We don't really know yet. But kind of if they hit, then you've
Right.
really outkicked what you paid for them. So you don't necessarily have to swing for the fences every round either. You just want to make sure when you get to the end of the draft, you have a few things where you kind of look back and say, if this guy emerges and, this team, if this offense is as good as I think it can be, then I've got a shot. And you kind of build in that upside as much as you can.
Yeah, I like that. James, it sounded like you had something you wanted to add earlier.
Oh, yeah, just about pushing guys up, like you said. You're going to see in the championship quarterbacks get pushed up, especially those top-end ones, because people are trying to complete their stack. If they take Devontae Adams, they might take Aaron Rodgers a round before they normally would. So
that's a good point. Yeah, reach a little bit just to complete the stack.
I know, like when I'm doing them, I'm reaching for the quarterbacks in those. Mainly my first one.
Do you have a stack that you're on more than others this year, James? Or
my favorite probably lately has been Prescott and Cooper. I just think it's a pretty good value stack. 3rd round Cooper and Dak in like the 10th or 11th. Can't beat that.
That's a good question, Dan.
Especially with Zeke, you don't know what's happening there. So I might as well just go with the passing game for now.
Right.
Who's your stack, Dan?
Well, I'm kind of looking for that like offense that I think could just blow out expectations. So there's 2 of them for me this year, like the Chiefs last year and Rams. One's Carolina, and I'm really into Curtis Samuel and Cam Newton. Those are kind of my guys in that 8th, 9th round area. It used to be 9th and 10th round. They're kind of up a little bit, but we've seen it from Cam. Like Cam can have these big games. He's had 4 top 5 QB seasons, so we know he can do it. And he has this really fun group of young weapons. I mean, I like DJ Moore too. So if that hits, it feels like it could hit big. And then the other's Kyler Murray with Christian Kirk. And, it doesn't fit the youth narrative, but even Larry Fitzgerald's pretty interesting because you can kind of pair those guys in the 8th and 10th round, 9th and 10th round, where if that Arizona offense with Cliff Kingsbury, if it ends up being fast-paced and fun and scoring a bunch of points, then those guys are going to have really big years. So I'm kind of looking at these offenses where we don't know for sure how good they'll be, but if it hits, it could be really fun, kind of like Mahomes and the Chiefs last year.
Yeah.
I would also add in Andrew Luck and T.Y. Hilton. Now that you're talking, they're coming to me. So
Nice.
those 2 are my favorite. That's my favorite stack is the Colts. You have to pay for Luck, but you can get Hilton in the 3rd round as well every time. And David cued in the strength of schedule in weeks 1 through 12. The Colts have one of the better schedules, but then you look from week 13 on in those playoff weeks, and they're the number 1. So they're kind of no-brainer to me if they get a chance. And plus, if you go with the Colts, they have so many options to stack. Like even if you get Luck and Hilton, you can also add Campbell, Doyle, Ebron. Like they're all kind of value, all the Funchess. All those guys are kind of that. Oh, Naheem Hines, another one I love. So I kind of like that. So
David, who are you stacking?
Yeah, I play it slightly different than kind of how these guys go. I mean, there's certainly stacks I'd love to get, but what I really try to do is I generally try to take a running back within obviously the first 2 rounds, but I will go super hard at receiver the next 4 to 5 picks. And that will define the stacks that I'm now going for. So in other words, if I have all of this core of what I consider really good receivers, I then queue up all of those quarterbacks to make sure I'm picking them a bit before the ADP so that I end up with a stack. So I go in with the whole predominant thing is I'm going to end up with stacks. And because I took receivers early, I know those guys that I have to try to get those quarterbacks. And I don't get, whether it's Carson Wentz to Alshon Jeffrey, or it's another one. It doesn't really matter to me so much as that I'm really just trying to focus to make sure that I end up the perfect build. Every one of these championship rosters has 2 stacks. So, I mean, so I'm spread a little bit more over different guys, just depending on the receivers I generally end up with.
Yeah. And David, I want to ask you about strength of schedule. You brought it up before. Finishing, at the top of your league in those first 12 weeks puts you in the money, but the real money is making it
Right.
deep into those playoff weeks. So are you putting a special emphasis on strength of schedule for weeks 13?
Yeah. So here's the thing. I mean, I looked at it a bit too, of kind of like what worked and didn't work last year. And much as Dan said, the top receivers that are becoming the top receivers, obviously wide receiver 2s, wide receiver 3s, they can kind of come from wherever, but the top guys are the top guys. Lock those down. But running backs and tight ends get hurt. In fact, on average, running backs play about 14 games a season, similar to tight ends. They're in the trenches. They get banged up. So those are the darts that I'm looking at. So I look hard at both the quarterbacks, tight ends, and even running backs' strength of schedule, looking for those bargains. And there's some fun ones. At running backs, you've got Miami, that's got a great 14 through 16. So you got to battle now, right? You've got, some people thought Drake. Now people are talking Balaj. Just take a stance on one of those guys is how I would approach this. So I don't know that we know it either right now, but both of those guys, one of those guys will be great value. One will be horrible value. Another, Washington is a great situation at running back as well for strength of schedule. So again, are you a Geis guy? Are you an Adrian Peterson guy? Are you a Chris Thompson guy? Maybe they all get hurt. Pick your guy. Don't try to get multiples of those. Pick your guy, center on him, make that about your draft based on some of these strength of schedule considerations. So that's kind of how I'm approaching it. Load up receivers, stack them to match, have one good running back and a bunch of crap looking to hit these home runs at the end that may pay off big dividends because of an easy schedule.
Yeah. Dan, what's your take on strength of schedule here?
Yeah, I think I look at it a little bit. I'm also looking at where they're playing the games. You don't necessarily want – it's probably not going to be a real high-scoring game like December in Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Chicago. So that's one of the reasons I like Arizona. They have 3 home games. It's going to be nice weather indoors. And just to kind of piggyback on what David's saying, I think you do try to gain an edge in how you build your roster from a positional perspective. It's really important to have that stud running back. So I think especially if you're drafting early, you can get one of those top 5 guys, lock in that guy who you just hope he stays healthy and hope he has a great year. And then you really hit wide receiver hard to, especially if you have that early pick, you can maybe take 4 or 5 wide receivers there in the next few rounds. And then you're coming back and trying to get those upside running backs, whether it's the rookies or the guys who you're not sure about, like David mentioned, Balaj, or, Miles Sanders, any of these younger guys who, especially, late, if you get one of those guys who's one injury away, we talked about Chase Edmonds, Tony Pollard is one in Dallas, or especially not only do you have the possibility of Ezekiel Elliott injury, but, I mean, who knows when he's going to show up? It seems like he's probably just fine, but we were saying the same thing this time last year about Le'Veon Bell, and James Conner was the biggest difference maker in the regular season in these. So I do think you want to reserve some picks late for those upside running backs because we're probably not hitting a huge home run at wide receiver late. You might be able to hit one with a young backup running back.
Now, because we're so focused on some of these later weeks, James, does this raise the value a little bit of guys who have maybe uncertain early start of the year, but we feel pretty confident that they're going to do something better later in the year? Someone like an AJ Green, who sounds like he's going to miss regular season games, but he could have a great second half of the season.
I mean, it all comes down to value. Where say AJ Green's gonna, if your roster construction at the time AJ Green comes on the board, if you're already have 3 wide receivers, yeah, why not? I mean, that's great. If it's 5th or 6th, I don't know. I'd probably almost 6th round nowadays. So.
I'm going to disagree with James a little bit. I like AJ in the 4th round, even late 4th round. Godwin's kind of my guy in the middle of the 4th round. But in these big tournaments, you can get through those first 3 weeks because there's no buys. You should have 7 wide receivers. You'll have 6 healthy guys to kind of cover those weeks. And then there's just such a huge premium on those late season weeks because, an extra 10 points, in week 1 or 2, it helps you. I mean, it helps you maybe get through. but that extra 10 points late in the year is just so big, because if it gets you through one of those playoff rounds, it just increases your chances of winning money by so much. We talked about one of the guys last year who was in a really similar situation with Alshon Jeffrey, where we got into training camp and it's like, he's not healthy. He's going to be week 4 or so. And then he just kept falling and falling in drafts. And I was able to grab him in the 8th round. And he was on my team that made the finals. And he showed up with a huge, I think he had 170 yards like week 14 or 15, and was like the last guy to put me over the top. Whereas like, that big game in week 2, who knows if it helps you or not. So I'm fine with being a little bit more aggressive on some of these guys, like Edelman last year. And even, we haven't talked about him yet, but Melvin Gordon. I'm totally out on Melvin Gordon in just these normal 12-teamers where you're trying to finish in the top 2 or 3.
Right.
But he starts to get interesting in these tournaments, because if he comes back, even if it's mid-year, if you've kind of been able to weather the storm, have a good team, he could put you over the top at the end. So I think there's some real value to trying to find a bargain with these late season guys who are going to perform better later in the year.
Yeah, we're going to talk about a few other strategy tips here, but before we go on, I just wanted to mention, be sure to check out our free Draft Dominator mobile app. If you look in the iTunes store or in the Google Play Store, search for Footballguys Draft Dominator. It's fully functioning for free, and then you can unlock some bonus features for the premium version for $4.99. But check it out. It's really functional for mock drafts and for drafting alongside your live draft to get a dynamic list of players that changes as your draft goes on. The word uniqueness gets thrown around a lot, especially when it comes to, say, like GPPs in the DFS world or in a championship like this. David, talk to us a little bit about your feelings on uniqueness for this format, and then I might pitch it back to Dan, who might have a different perspective on this.
Right. Yeah. So you think of it like this. You've got to win your league to even get into the money rounds, but all of the major money, you have to finish top 3 out of 24 teams that all advanced. I mean, think of how good those teams are. So when you're drafting a Kelsey or an Ertz or just some player like that, you know what? There's going to be 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 Kelseys in this championship bracket that you're in. So I think it says a lot about how you build your roster, and just even end up with crazy players. Like, so let's just say you go for a Rob Gronkowski, who clearly isn't on a roster. New England owns its rights. There's a real strong chance he never even plays a single thing. Clearly, if he doesn't play, you lost. But let's say they do bring him back around week 12. And now all of a sudden you got a guy in the 18th round that is only now on 7% of the rosters, and you happen to be a team that makes it to the finals or makes it into this final bracket, and he's putting up old Rob Gronkowski numbers as a tight end 7 overall, and you're the only guy in your bracket that has it. You can see how you can just absolutely gain massive amounts of traction on guys that aren't getting picked. So I think it's extremely smart to know that ADP real well at the, I call it the 205 to 230 level on draft. They group a ton of guys at like 216 plus, which is just all guys that usually aren't getting drafted. Because if you hit on some of those guys, like perfect example, last year, Ian Thomas played for the injured, I can't even think his name, Greg Olsen for Carolina. He had huge weeks when it really, really counted, and it was on no one's rosters. If you found a spot on your roster to carry and get yourself into the thing, Ian Thomas potentially carried your way the rest of the way. And those are the difference makers that I think you have to have some of those on your roster. And obviously you can't be taking shots at those in round 12, but it's an 18-round pick, draft. It's like round 16, 17, 18. You need to have high upside, I think, unique players to give yourself just a lot better chance to win some serious money in this.
Dan, I want to hear your perspective on this. I think it's slightly different.
Yeah, so I kind of get what David's saying. So like in this big $3.5 million best ball tournament, only 1 out of every 512 league winners makes the finals. So there is this, it has to be a very special team. But on like a smaller scale, you only have to be in the top 1 out of 8 each week. So there's automatically you're pretty unique. So using David's example of like Ian Thomas, So you're in a league with 24 people. They maybe have 2 tight ends each, 2 or 3. There might only be 50 or 60 tight ends total. And, you know, some of them, like David said, if they had a great year, they might be on 6 or 7 rosters. But you don't have to be crazy to have a couple guys who you're the only one, because you don't have to draft off the wall. There's going to be a lot of normal 12th, 8th round tight ends who are on only one roster just because there's only 24 teams. So it's not necessarily the same as like a big GPP because it's these really small each week. I would say the one thing where I do kind of agree with David is if you have a guy who has like real difference making upside over multiple weeks. So the one example from last year would have been Damian Williams, because it wasn't just like, oh, he got 12 points one week. It was like, you know, Kareem Hunt's out and Damian Williams is getting 30 points and week after week. So if you have one of those backup running backs that's under the radar that people aren't drafting, who actually could string together multiple big weeks, I think there is some real upside there. But if it's just like, you know, I'm going to draft this wide receiver 3 on Jacksonville over this other wide receiver 3, you know, it doesn't really matter if you're unique in that sense, because unless he's going to string together a bunch of big weeks on a smaller basis each week, I think there's automatically going to be uniqueness to your lineup just because there's only 24 teams.
James, what's your take on this uniqueness topic? Are you sort of like hunting for guys that are like, man, I want to have like 1 or maybe 2 guys that are just largely going undrafted? Or are you sort of like, you know what, I'm just going to kind of draft the best team I think I can find?
Yeah, I think I maybe play it safer than David and Dan a little bit when it comes to uniqueness. I do kind of keep the 17 to 18 round for those kind of guys, but I'm not taking shots on, you know, if this guy's, how many games is he going to miss? He's already injured or he's a suspended player. I'm not going to take Kareem Hunt. That's not going to, like, he's going to start 1 or 2 games for you in the regular until you get to the playoffs. So I think I get stuck on playing the regular ones and it kind of carries over for me. So I'm only taking a couple shots usually, but I try to be unique in a lot of other ways where to start out my draft, maybe I'll just go 6 wide receivers to start. I'll go 0 running backs, or maybe I'll go 4 running backs to start. But I try to be different in the way I construct every time. So that's kind of where I try to be unique, more than just taking 5 dart throws at the end of the draft. So I want to have that unique team where maybe I own 3 star players that everybody else only owns 2 of those star players. So that's kind of how I'm trying to be different in building my unique team.
That's a good spin on uniqueness. I like that. It's like you use roster construction instead of targeting necessarily a specific player.
I got a point where I think hardly anybody is doing, and I think there's an edge to be gained on getting uniqueness at quarterback. So the very thing we just talked about was we've all said, oh, let's just get 2 quarterbacks, get 2 tight ends. Well, 2 quarterbacks times 12 people is 24 quarterbacks. So 8 quarterbacks on average are getting undrafted. Well, if you look through, again, Clayton Gray's schedule strength, and it's early on, obviously those numbers will adjust and as we see things, but Denver, Miami, New York Giants, Tennessee all have extremely easy schedules in week 14 through 16. Well, those are Flacco. You've got, you know, who's starting at Miami. We're not really sure. Is Eli still standing for the Giants? Those guys aren't exciting players, Marcus Mariota. But honestly, if nobody has those guys and those are the guys that hit and you have that stack, you could be a real differentiator on a player that literally is going to play pretty much every week. You're Marcus Mariota, you're going to get every week. It just isn't a quarterback you normally would probably take. But when you're getting him in the 17th, 18th round, again, I think you can get uniqueness and get a player and achieve both of those things, especially that fits into a strength of schedule situation. I also think in this format, even though I prefer to go 2 tight ends, I do think taking a shot at a 3rd tight end in this format could make giant difference, especially if you can get somebody like an Ian Thomas, Rob Gronkowski, Matt Lacoste, something like that, where it's like all or nothing player that could be a difference maker.
That's a good point. Someone put on the show sheet to talk about win rates. Dan, was that you? Who wanted to talk a little bit about win rates? I don't fully understand this, and I want to understand it better.
I think
I think
that's
it was
more
James.
for the regular
It's more for regular.
leagues. Yeah, so win rates, so it's only one person advancing in the championships, so it doesn't really come into play in these.
Got it. Got it. Well, let's talk about a little bit more of an advanced topic, sort of measuring your ownership percentages. If you're big on these championships and you're going to multi-enter these things, especially like the mini, you might throw in like 5, 10, 20 entries, whatever. What is your guys' system for sort of tracking your ownership, and how much do you worry about balancing it versus taking a lot of risk and just saying, you know what, I'm going to go all in on a few players? Maybe that's a question for you, Dan.
Yeah, so I think I'm a little more aggressive than most people. If I like somebody, I'm not afraid to have them on 40% of my teams. So there's not the ADP is pretty good. So if you think you have an edge on one or two guys, I think you just try to leverage that edge as much as you can, and then kind of fill in the rest. There are some guys who you're like, do I want to have none of this guy at all? And it's especially somebody who, if they have a ton of upside, we're like, oh man, I don't know. Like, I'm not necessarily targeting Deshaun Watson, but I can see some scenarios where like Deshaun Watson just has a monster year. So he's one of those guys who I'm not going out of my way for him. Cam's kind of my guy. But, if Deshaun Watson slides a little bit and I'm doing a bunch of these drafts, I'm going to take him some just to have that little bit. But I do think though that if you kind of end up like 10 to 15% of everybody, you're almost just kind of paying the rake because you're going to end up not having a big edge on the field. So I think it's important to pick a few guys who you feel strongly about, reach on those guys a little bit if you need to, take them half a round early. And if you have a real strong feeling for one of these guys and they hit, then all of a sudden you have, maybe a third of your teams are in this great spot because you hit on one guy and you've drafted him a bunch.
Yeah, that's a good take. David, what's your thoughts on ownership
I
percentages?
think Dan and I, we should just match up each other in all the same contests. We approach it completely different. I somewhat agree with Dan. I mean, there are guys I just definitely like, and I pretty much have them on a whole slew of rosters. But almost just conversely, the other thing I like to look at is I'll look at that ownership percentage, see what I'm tracking high on guys, and I'll try to make that counter argument. What if I'm completely wrong on this guy? Let's just completely scratch him off the list. What happens, and how do my rankings adjust? So a lot of times when I'm doing these tournament ones, I will actually just take a few stances. Okay, Balaj wins the running back job outright. Mike Davis wins the running back job outright. And how do my rankings adjust to make that play? Or no, I'm completely wrong. It is actually David Montgomery. How do I slot him in as the starting running back? So a lot of these controversies, I'll take a stand for that particular draft, just my rankings kind of accordingly based on that. Slamming the guy that's now, I've considered not to be a part of a running back committee. He's going to be the losing end of it, and then make that draft accordingly. So again, kind of plays into what everybody's saying, but I almost approach the championship with the draft specific goal of saying, this is the draft I'm going after Adrian Peterson. This is the draft I'm going after, and literally try to lock down. Sometimes it doesn't happen. Somebody else might be targeting that guy, but I'll have like 4 or 5 guys that I'm building this team around. And then the rest of my draft kind of fits within my normal guys. And then I'll completely change that up for the very next one.
Nice. James, we're almost to the closing of this episode. Any parting thoughts or any other thoughts on this ownership question?
I'm kind of also, I don't go too high on one player, but I try to stay around 25%, maybe some 30%, but I don't go over 30% very often on just one player. It's too many things can happen. So like another example too, like James Washington and Dante Moncrief. So I'll look at those players. They're kind of same ADP. You like one, like the other, but then I'll notice, I have 15% Moncrief and only 3% Washington. So that's when I go in, then I'll bump up Washington ahead of Moncrief, just so I'm getting more when it's my turn my ranks come up and I can take Washington over. Just try to level it out a little bit. So just different situations like that. Or if there's like 2 running backs I like similar, maybe like Austin Eckler and Latavius Murray, maybe I'm pretty high on Murray, so I'm like 25% on Murray. So in Eckler, maybe I want to bump up even more. So just different things like that I look at, just kind of making sure different similar situations and kind of leveling it out a little bit. So I'm not too high or too low on one player.
And it sounds like you're leaning a little bit more into some of these more cash style sort of tournaments. You're playing, 600 plus, contests. And so you've got to really manage this ownership to sort of play it smartly with your bankroll. And so I think that approach fits with what you're doing there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it even carries over to the championship though. I still look just the championship and kind of adjust that way as well.
Right on. Right on. All right, guys. Well, that's going to do it for episode 2 of this trilogy of best ball draft strategy. Be sure to visit footballguys.com for our latest best ball articles and our latest subscription deals. Big thank you to David Dodds and Dan Hindrey and James Brimacombe for sharing their knowledge today. Be sure to check out episode 3 in this best ball trilogy, and we're going to identify our favorite picks in detail, round by round in that episode. If you'd like to jump to that episode, click on the video that's on Dan's face. And if you'd like to jump back to show number 1 and you missed that, be sure to click on the video that's in front of James' face. And then if you'd like to subscribe to our YouTube channel, please click on the Black-Eyed Joe that is on David's face. I'm Austin Lee saying thank you for watching and thanks for being a football guy.